Chapter 24, Section 4 of J.B. Bury's The Students' Roman Empire, Part 2. The Students' Roman Empire, Part 2, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 24. Trajan's Principate, Section 4. Trajan's Wars and Conquests in the East. His death. Ever since Tiridates had received the Armenian diadem from the hands of Nero, peace had subsisted between Rome and Parthia. The relations between the Flavian emperors and the Arsacids had hardly been troubled by a single cloud, but under Trajan they became less friendly. King Pacorus did not decline to negotiate with Decebalus, the enemy of Rome. This negotiation, however, was not followed by any action on the part of Parthia, and did not lead to hostilities. But under Chosroes, the brother and successor of Pacorus, the crucial question of Armenia came up once more. The Armenian throne having become vacant, Trajan bestowed it upon Axidares, a son of Pacorus, but Chosroes deposed Axidares, and set up Parthomasiris, another son of Pacorus, on the ground that Axidares was incapable of governing. This action of Chosroes was a direct violation of the treaty existing between the two states, and Trajan was not a man to pass this over. He declared war immediately, and left Rome for the east at the end of 113 A.D. When he reached Athens, he was met by a Parthian embassy sent to divert him from his purpose, for Chosroes was not prepared for war. At this time Parthia was distracted by internal dissensions, and several rival kings were ruling in different parts of the realm. The ambassadors declared that Parthomasiris was prepared to acknowledge himself the client of Rome, and receive the diadem from Trajan as Tiridates had received it from Nero. But the emperor refused to recognize one who had been set up in defiance of his authority. He dismissed the embassy, saying shortly that he looked for deeds and not for words. Another emperor would probably have been satisfied with the compromise, and Trajan, if he had intended to follow the eastern policy of his predecessors, would not have dismissed the Parthian envoys as he did. But he had come to the conclusion that the settlement of the Armenian question which had been come to in the reign of Nero was no settlement at all, and he determined to make the position of Armenia clear by converting it into a Roman province. This step, which previous emperors had declined to take, would remove once for all every pretext for Parthian interference in Armenia, and put an end to the unsatisfactory combination of nominal Roman sway and real Parthian influence. The resolve of Trajan was quite in accordance with his previous policy in the case of Dacia and Arabia. The conversion of client states into provinces is a feature of his reign. But his purpose went even further than the annexation of Armenia. He decided to carry out an idea which had been in the air for more than 100 years, and subdue the realm of Parthia, as he had subdued the realm of Decebalus. It was a project which Julius Caesar might have attempted if he had lived. It was an inspiration of Roman poets, from Horace, who dreams of Rome giving laws to the vanquished Medes, to Statius, who, in addressing Domitian on his 17th consulate, reminds him that Bactra and Babylon still remained to be curbed by a new tribute. From Athens Trajan proceeded to Antioch, and found that the Syrian army had degenerated in discipline and vigor owing to the long peace, so that his first task was to restore the efficiency of the troops. There were 7 legions in the east available for the Parthian war, 4 in Syria, 1 in Judea, and 2 in Cappadocia, in addition to which Trajan summoned some Pannonian reinforcements, but it is uncertain how he apportioned his forces. Hostilities had already commenced, and the advantage was on the side of the Parthians, who had taken Samosata. Before Trajan took the field in spring 115 A.D., he received a letter from the pretender Parthomasiris, of which he took no notice, because the writer styled himself king. The first event of the campaign was the recovery of Samosata. Thence Trajan marched to Satala in Little Armenia, intending to make that country the basis of his operations. At Satala he was met by the kings of various Caucasian countries, who came to assure him of their devotion and obedience, such as the Iberians, Albanians, and Apsilians. Among others, Anchialus, king of the Heniochi and Machelones, was distinguished with marks of favor by the Emperor, to whom the attitude of these northern barbarians was a matter of importance for the success of his further operations. Here, too, another message was received from Parthomasiris, couched in far humbler terms than the previous one, and begging for an interview with M. Junius, the governor of Cappadocia. Trajan sent the son of Junius to treat with the pretender, and himself, returning on his steps, proceeded with the army in the direction of Artaxata, and halted at Elegia, near Erzeroum, a locality well adapted for concentrating forces. Here Parthomasiris was permitted to wait upon the Emperor, who took his seat on a seggestus in the presence of his troops. The Parthian prince, taking the diadem from his head, laid it at the feet of Trajan, in order that the ceremonial of investiture might be performed. But the soldiers, misunderstanding his attitude, and thinking that he was renouncing Armenia, conceived that this country was won for Rome without a blow, and saluted Trajan as imperator. Frightened by the cries of the soldiers, Parthomasiris made as if he would flee, but he was surrounded and could not escape. He then begged for a private interview with the Emperor, and was led into the imperial tent. But Trajan's mind was made up, and the Parthians' offer was rejected. After a few minutes they issued from the tent. Trajan resumed his seat on the seggestus, and commanded Parthomasiris to declare his demands clearly before the army, in order that the words which passed between them might never be falsely reported. The soldiers pressed round, but Parthomasiris, in this dangerous situation, did not lose his self-possession. He said simply that Armenia rightly belonged to him on condition of receiving the diadem from Trajan's hands, that he had come of his own accord for this purpose, and not as a defeated or captured enemy, and that he expected to suffer no injury. The Emperor, in reply, shortly announced that Armenia belonged to Rome, and should henceforth be ruled by a Roman governor. Parthomasiris, with his Parthian retinue, was then permitted to depart under an escort of Roman horse, to prevent them from holding communications with anyone until they were beyond the frontiers of Armenia. The Armenians who had accompanied him were sent back to their own homes. Soon after he had left the camp, Parthomasiris was slain by his escort. It is unknown whether this act was committed in cold blood by the orders of Trajan, or whether the Parthian prince made an attempt to escape from his conductors. Armenia submitted to its fate without a struggle, and became a Roman province. The Caucasian kingdoms now stood to Rome in the same relation in which Armenia stood before. Meanwhile, the Moorish captain, Lucius Quietus, who had distinguished himself in the Dacian war, had hastened eastward with a part of the army, crossed the Araxes, and occupied Atropatene, or Media. He surprised the strong and important fortress of Singara, whose possession was a great advantage for an invader of Parthia. As soon as Trajan had occupied Armenia, he marched into Mesopotamia, where he met with little resistance. Batanae and Nisibis were taken without difficulty, and the fortress of Thebitha, between Nisibis and Singara, secured a line of communication between the main army and the detachment of Lucius Quietus. Abgar, king of Osroene, had long ago volunteered to desert his allegiance to Parthia, and became a Roman vassal. At Edessa he publicly offered his submission to the conqueror, and other phylarchs and satraps followed his example. Civil war among the Parthians hindered them from taking any steps to oppose the conquest of the land between the Euphrates and Tigris. The king Chosroes was overthrown by a pretender of Arab race, named Manisares, who now sent a message to Trajan, proposing to divide the spoils of the Arsacid. Trajan refused to entertain the proposal, or admit the envoys to a conference, and Manisares allied himself with another Arab king, Manus, and prepared to oppose the advance of the Romans. But Trajan did not intend to cross the Tigris until the following year, as the season was already far advanced. He organized Mesopotamia as a Roman province, and retired to Antioch for the winter. His stay there was marked by a terrible earthquake, December 13, 115 A.D., which cost many lives, and demolished a large part of the city, and Trajan himself narrowly escaped destruction. the winter was employed with the construction of a fleet on the Euphrates, which was to operate in the next campaign along with the army. Trajan, ennobled by the name of Parthicus, which the Senate had decreed to him, proceeded to Nisibis in spring (116 A.D.), and thence led his army to the upper Tigris, where it flows through the district of Corduene. The passage of the river was made on boats, which had been built in the woods of Nisibis, and transported thence on wagons. The army crossed with difficulty, for the Carduchians of the adjacent mountains lined the opposite shore, but at length, seeing that the numbers of the Romans rendered resistance hopeless, the barbarians retired. The whole country of the Adiabene was occupied by Trajan with little opposition, and was made into a third Roman province under the name of Assyria. Recrossing the Tigris, Trajan joined his fleet on the Euphrates, and reviewed his troops at Osagardana, near the bitumen springs which supplied the Babylonians with building cement. Babylon, nearly deserted by its inhabitants on account of the civil wars, fell an easy prey to the Romans, who then proceeded to attack Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital. The two rivers were connected by the Nahar Malcha, or royal canal, which joined the Tigris at Ctesiphon, and this canal was used by Trajan to transport his ships from the Euphrates to the Tigris. His plans for the siege of Ctesiphon rendered it necessary to disembark his troops on the left bank of the Tigris at a distance from the city, and accordingly a new canal was dug connecting the Nahar Malcha with the river at a point above Ctesiphon. The Romans soon captured the capital of the Arsacids. Chosroes himself escaped, but his daughter was captured, and the golden throne of the Parthian kings was taken and reserved for the triumph of Trajan. With this success the soldiers regarded Parthia as conquered, or, at least, its conquest as assured, and Parthia Capta was inscribed on coins. The Emperor then descended the Tigris with 50 ships, as far as Charax Spasinu near its mouth. This place was in the territory of Attambelos, king of Messene, who submitted to the Roman conqueror and became his tributary. Old as Trajan was, his imagination was excited by this proximity to the Indian Sea. At Charax, seeing a vessel bound for the Indies, he expressed regret that he was not young enough to visit them himself. He was the first western conqueror since Alexander the Great who had penetrated so far, and he may have dreamed of rivalling Alexander by still more extensive conquests. But he was speedily aroused from his dreams by the news that the lands which he had won so easily, Babylonia and Mesopotamia, had revolted. A legion under the general Maximus was cut to pieces by the insurgents. Nisibis, Seleucia, and Edessa slew or drove out the Roman garrisons, and shut their gates. This rebellion, in which the Jews played a prominent part, was suppressed, but not without difficulty. The important cities which had revolted were treated severely. In Babylonia, Seleucia was taken by Eurucius Clarus and Julius Alexander and burnt to the ground. The recovery of Mesopotamia, where the Jewish populations were the leaders of the revolt, was entrusted to the gallant Moor, Lucius Quietus. He besieged and reduced both Nisibius and Edessa, and the city of Abgar, who had doubtless fallen a victim to the rebels, was burnt down like Seleucia. This revolt forced Trajan to be content for the present with the 3 new provinces which he had added to the empire by his 2 campaigns, and to desist from further conquests, especially as the Parthians were rallying forces and preparing to make an attempt to wrest Armenia from its new lord. Trajan prevented their projects by a stroke of diplomacy. Although he had not penetrated further than the western borders of the great eastern realm, he regarded Parthia as a conquered country, and at Ctesiphon bestowed a crown upon Parthamaspates, son of Chosroes, who accepted it as a client of Rome. Thus a king was given to the Parthians, Rex Parthius Datus, as coins record, and thus Parthia itself came to hold nominally the same position towards Rome as formerly Armenia. The Roman army then returned to Syria. On the way an attempt was made to take Hatra, a small but strongly fortified city in the Mesopotamian desert, on the way from Ctesiphon to Singara. The nature of the country and the parching sun rendered a long siege impossible, and the inhabitants were brave. Though a breach was made in the walls, the soldiers could not enter. Trajan himself, approaching with a small body of horse and conspicuous by his white hair and majestic form, was the mark for the arrows of the garrison, but he escaped injury, though a horseman at his side was slain. A thunderstorm compelled the Romans to retreat, and the sufferings that they endured from the heat, noxious insects, and want of water and pasture, saved Hatra from further assaults. The Emperor returned to Antioch about April 117 A.D. The attempt of Mesopotamia to throw off the yoke of Rome was closely connected with another more widespread movement of rebellion in the eastern provinces of the Empire. 50 years had not fully elapsed since the great Jewish war which ended in the destruction of Jerusalem, and now the Jews made another desperate attempt to break free from the rule of their Roman masters. Their hope was to drive both Greeks and Romans out of those countries in which there was a considerable Jewish population: Cyprus, the Cyrenaica, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Palestine, and form an independent Jewish state. They chose the moment when the Emperor was in the far east. Wherever the insurgents succeeded, they exterminated their enemies with relentless fury. In Cyprus, which had long been the refuge of Jews from Palestine and Syria, it is said that 240,000 were slain. When the revolt was afterwards put down, the Jews were forbidden thenceforth to set foot on the island. In Cyrenaica, a senatorial province, unprotected by a military garrison, the Jewish population outnumbered the natives, and under a chief named Andrew or Lucullus, who assumed the title of king, obtained rapid successes. Here 220,000 natives were slain with great barbarity. In Egypt, the prefect, Rutilius Lupus, unprepared for the emergency, was compelled to shut himself up in Alexandria. The Jews in the city, though numerous, were in a minority, and were massacred by the Greeks. Trajan sent Q. Marcius Turbo with an army and fleet to restore order in Egypt and Cyrene, and the rebels were soon crushed by the trained troops. The Jews of Egypt were almost exterminated. The suppression of the movement in Mesopotamia by Lucius Quietus has already been narrated. Not only the Jews took advantage of the absence of the Emperor in the far east, but the enemies of Rome in other quarters also seized the opportunity to rebel or invade. The Danubian provinces were threatened by the Sarmatians. Africa was harried by the Moors. A revolt broke out in Britain. Thus Trajan's presence was earnestly demanded in the west, and the Senate urged his return. The Eastern war was regarded as finished, and preparations were made at Rome for a brilliant triumph. But, like Alexander whom he emulated, he was not destined to reach home. His journey was interrupted at Selinus in Cilicia by an illness to which he succumbed. He died on August 8, 117 A.D. The triumph over the Parthians was celebrated in his name after his death, and was the only case in which a dead emperor obtained that honour. The consecrated conqueror, Divus Trajanus Parthicus, as he was designated, was represented by a statue in the triumphal car. His ashes, placed in a golden urn, were buried at the foot of his own pillar in his own forum, and he is the only one of the emperors whose remains were permitted to rest within the limits of the city. Trajan must have been well aware that his easily won successes in the east had been largely due to the internal divisions of Parthia, and that his conquests would be endangered as soon as unity should be restored. The institution of a dependent Parthian kingdom cannot have been more than a temporary device for the purpose of avoiding an immediate difficulty; or, at least, if Trajan intended it to be permanent, he must have known well that it would need more fighting and bloodshed to establish a lasting overlordship over Parthia. Alexander's conquests had been won at Issus and Arbela, but Trajan's had been almost bloodless. It is probable that Trajan intended to return to the east after his triumph and renew the war, for the purpose of reducing the power of the Parthians, and securing more firmly the frontiers of his new provinces. He had made the Tigris, instead of the Euphrates, the eastern boundary of the empire, and it was a boundary perhaps more easy to defend. It is rash and unjust to condemn this extension of the Empire as a mistake into which Trajan was misled by mere ambition; for his conduct can be explained and defended on political grounds. Once he condemned the Armenian policy of his predecessors, and it certainly was not unassailable, and decided to annex Armenia, the annexation of Mesopotamia was a logical consequence. The province of Assyria was in advanced position beyond the Tigris, somewhat as the province of Dacia beyond the Danube. The new acquisitions should have been a great commercial advantage for Rome by bringing into her hands command of a whole line of traffic from Syria to the Persian Gulf. But owing to Trajan's inopportune death and the different policy of his successor, the Empire was not permitted to test the consequences of an eastward extension of its borders. CHAPTER 25.